It started as a quiet evening on our small farm, the kind of night that usually slips by without notice. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields, and I was sitting on the porch, sipping a beer and enjoying the silence. Life out here was predictable, steady until that night. Something had been bothering me about my wife, Emily, for weeks. She'd been distant, her laughter less frequent, her smiles no longer reaching her eyes. I tried to brush it off, blaming the stress of farm life, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Then, a few days ago, I started noticing her disappearing at odd times. I wasn't one to snoop, but that night, as the orange glow of the setting sun faded into twilight, I couldn't help but follow her. She had said she was going to check on the animals in the barn, a routine task she did every evening. But something about the way she avoided my gaze as she left made my stomach churn. The barn was a short walk from the house, a sturdy structure we'd built together years ago. As I approached, the cool evening air carried with it the faint smell of hay and something else I couldn't quite place. The large wooden doors were slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see the faint glow of a lantern inside. I hesitated, my heart pounding. What was I expecting to find? Emily brushing down one of the horses? Tending to the goats? Yet, deep down, I knew it was something more. My instincts told me that whatever was happening in that barn wasn't as innocent as it should be. Quietly, I crept closer, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. The light from the lantern flickered, casting shadows that danced across the barn walls. I could hear Emily's voice, low and hushed, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. And then I heard it, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. A low, guttural noise, almost like a groan, followed by a soft laugh from Emily. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside, my breath caught in my throat. There she was standing in the middle of the barn, her back to me. Her long hair was tied back, her dress clinging to her figure as she moved. She was leaning forward slightly, her hands resting on something out of view. The lantern cast her shadow across the wall, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, something large shifting behind her. I blinked, trying to make sense of the scene. My wife wasn't alone. The barn was filled with an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of hay and the strange noises that seemed to come from the shadows. Emily's voice was soft, almost soothing, as she murmured something I couldn't hear. My chest tightened, a mix of confusion and dread swelling inside me. "Emily?" I called out, my voice hesitant as I pushed the door open a little wider. She froze, her head whipping around to face me. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked almost guilty. "Oh," she said, her voice shaky. "I didn't hear you come in. What are you doing?" I asked, my gaze darting past her, trying to see what she was hiding. "Just taking care of something," she said quickly, stepping to the side as if to block my view. "It's nothing. You don't need to worry." But I did worry. I stepped closer, the dim light from the lantern revealing more of the scene. Behind her, in the shadows, I could make out a large, dark shape. It moved slightly, the sound of shuffling hooves echoing through the barn. "Is that?" I started, but the words caught in my throat. Emily reached out, her hand brushing against my arm. "It's fine," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've got it under control." I glanced at her, then back at the shadowed figure. Something about the way she was acting, so guarded, so defensive, made my skin crawl. This wasn't like her. Emily had always been open, easy to read. But now, there was a tension in her posture, a flicker of something unspoken in her eyes. "Emily," I said slowly, my voice low. "What's going on?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped back, her hands gripping the edge of a nearby stall. "It's nothing, really," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just go back to the house. I'll be there soon." But I couldn't leave. Not now. Something wasn't right, and I needed to know what. I stepped closer, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. The shadows in the barn seemed to grow darker, and the faint creaking of the wooden beams overhead only added to the tension. "Emily, move," I said, my voice firmer this time. "I need to see." Her eyes darted to the side, a flicker of panic crossing her face. "It's really nothing," she insisted, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "You're overthinking this." "I'll decide that," I shot back, stepping around her before she could stop me. As I moved into the light of the lantern, the full scene came into view. The large figure in the shadows shifted again, and my breath caught in my throat. There, in the far corner of the barn, was Horse. That's what Emily always called him, a name that had seemed odd at first, but I'd never questioned it. The big stallion had been around for years, a constant presence in our lives. But something about the way he stood there, his muscles tense, his dark eyes watching me, made my skin crawl. Emily had been standing so close to him, her hands moving in ways that seemed unusual. "What are you doing with him?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mix of confusion and anger. Emily's cheeks flushed, and she quickly turned away, busying herself with the lantern. "Just making sure he's comfortable," she said, her tone clipped. "He's been restless lately." I frowned, my eyes narrowing as I studied her. "Restless? That's not what it looked like." Her hand faltered, and she glanced at me over her shoulder. "You're being ridiculous," she said, her voice sharp. "It's a horse, for God's sake." But was it? The thought lodged itself in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. There was something in her tone, in the way she avoided my gaze, that made me question everything. The sounds I'd heard earlier, the tension in her movements, it didn't add up. I stayed in the barn that night, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. Emily had tried to brush past me, to leave without another word, but I wasn't about to let this go. "You're not telling me everything," I said, blocking her path. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You're making this into something it's not," she said, her voice tired. "I'm just trying to take care of the animals. Isn't that what you want me to do?" "Not like this," I replied, my voice low. "You were acting strange, Emily. I know what I saw." Her eyes flashed with frustration, and she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't know anything, so stop acting like you do." The words hit me like a slap, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. She pushed past me, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor as she disappeared into the night. I was left standing there, alone with the flickering lantern and the shadows that seemed to close in around me. The next day, I tried to act normal, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Emily avoided me, her eyes darting away whenever I tried to meet her gaze. She spent most of her time in the barn, coming inside only when necessary. I decided to keep watch that evening, waiting until she thought I'd gone to bed. Sure enough, as the house settled into silence, I heard the faint creak of the back door. Peering out the window, I saw her figure moving across the yard, her lantern swinging in the darkness. I followed her, keeping my distance as I moved through the shadows. The barn loomed ahead, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, the lantern light flickered, casting strange shapes on the walls. I crept closer, my heart racing as I reached the doorway. Emily's voice was soft, almost inaudible, but I could hear the faint edge of urgency in her tone. She was talking to him, Horse. I peered inside, careful to stay hidden. She was standing close to him again, her hands moving over his side in a way that seemed almost tender. He shifted, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the barn floor. The scene was surreal, almost dreamlike. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and a creeping sense of dread. What was she doing? Why was she so secretive? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong? I crouched in the shadows of the barn doorway, my breath shallow as I watched the scene unfold. Emily's voice was calm, almost soothing, as she spoke softly to Horse. The sound of her words was muffled by the distance, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't just her usual chatter with the animals. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that there was some innocent explanation for all of this. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. Emily stepped closer to him, her hand trailing along his side as she murmured something I couldn't hear. He shifted, his massive frame moving slightly, and I heard the soft rustle of hay beneath his hooves. The sound was oddly rhythmic, almost deliberate. My pulse quickened as my mind raced. What was she doing? Why was she being so secretive about this? I had spent years trusting Emily, believing in the strength of our marriage. But now, watching her in the dim light of the barn, I felt like I didn't know her at all. I leaned in closer, trying to get a better look. The lantern flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. And for a moment, I thought I saw her hand linger in a way that made my chest tighten. The movements were too slow, too deliberate to be normal. "Emily," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. She spun around, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The barn was eerily silent, save for the faint creak of the wooden beams above us. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than I expected. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied, stepping into the barn. "What's going on?" Emily's gaze flicked to Horse, then back to me. "I told you I was just checking on him. He's been restless lately." "Restless?" I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "That's not what it looks like." Her cheeks flushed, and she quickly turned away, busying herself with the lantern. "You're being ridiculous," she said, her tone defensive. "He's an animal. What do you think is happening?" "I don't know," I admitted, my hands clenching at my sides. "But you're hiding something, Emily. I can see it in your eyes." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the lantern handle. "I'm not hiding anything," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't imagining it. I could feel it. The tension in the air, the unspoken words that hung heavy between us. I took a step closer, my eyes fixed on hers. "Then tell me the truth," I said, my voice low. "What's really going on?" Emily looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she brushed past me, her footsteps echoing in the quiet barn as she disappeared into the night. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the lantern's flickering light casting shadows that seemed to dance mockingly around me. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and a growing sense of dread. I couldn't let this go. I needed answers. The next day, I decided to confront her. I waited until she was outside, tending to the garden, and approached her with a calm I didn't feel. "Emily, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady. She looked up at me, her hands stilling in the dirt. "About what?" "You know what," I replied, crossing my arms. "The barn. Last night. This whole situation." Her expression hardened, and she straightened up, brushing the dirt from her hands. "I already told you. There's nothing to talk about." "That's not good enough," I said, my voice rising. "You're keeping secrets, Emily. I can feel it, and I won't stop until I know the truth." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Then she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Fine," she said quietly. "Come to the barn tonight. I'll show you everything." Her words left me uneasy, but I didn't back down. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself standing outside the barn, my heart pounding in my chest. The doors were slightly ajar, and the faint glow of the lantern spilled out into the darkness. I pushed the doors open, stepping inside. Emily was already there, her back to me as she stood beside Horse. The large figure shifted, his dark eyes glinting in the lantern light. Emily glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "I told you he's been restless," she said, her voice calm. "But there's more to it than that." I swallowed hard, my palms slick with sweat. "What do you mean?" She turned to face me fully, her hands resting on her hips. "You'll see." I stood frozen in the barn's doorway, the lantern's faint glow barely illuminating the shadows that surrounded us. Emily's expression was unreadable, her shoulders tense as she glanced back at Horse. The large figure shifted slightly, the faint rustle of hay breaking the heavy silence. "What do you mean, I'll see?" I asked, my voice unsteady. Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her attention back to him, her hands brushing along his side in slow, deliberate movements. The tension in the air was suffocating, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't. "Not now. You've been acting like I'm hiding some deep, dark secret," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "So here I am, showing you exactly what you've been so worried about." Her words only made my pulse quicken. I stepped closer, the wooden floor creaking beneath my boots. "This isn't normal, Emily. The way you've been with him, the way you're acting now, it doesn't make sense." She let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Does it have to make sense?" she asked, her eyes meeting mine. "Or are you just afraid of what you don't understand?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. My gaze flicked to Horse, his massive frame towering over her, his dark eyes watching me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "What are you trying to say?" I asked, my voice low. Emily hesitated, her hands stilling for just a moment before she stepped away from him. "I'm saying that sometimes things aren't as simple as they seem," she said softly. "But if you can't accept that, maybe you don't want to see the truth after all." Her words lingered in the air as she moved to the other side of the barn, her footsteps muffled by the hay. I stood there, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of everything. The lantern's light flickered, casting long shadows across the walls, and for a moment, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't understand. "I don't get it, Emily," I said finally, my voice rising with frustration. "What truth? What are you trying to tell me?" She turned to face me, her expression calm but unreadable. "You want answers," she said simply. "Then ask the right questions." I stared at her, my chest tightening. "Why am?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Why are you so close to him?" Emily smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Because he understands me," she said quietly. "In ways you never could." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "Emily," I started, but she shook her head. "This isn't about you," she said firmly. "It's about what I need, what I've always needed." I backed away slightly, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. Emily's voice was calm, almost soothing, but it only made the situation more surreal. The barn seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker as the lantern's light flickered and dimmed. "I don't know who you are anymore," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily stepped closer, her gaze steady. "I'm still me," she said softly. "You just never took the time to see it." Her words stung, and I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest. "This isn't about me not seeing you, Emily," I snapped. "This is about you hiding something. Something you don't want me to know." She didn't answer right away, her gaze flicking to Horse before returning to me. "Maybe you're right," she said finally. "Maybe there are things you're not ready to know." The barn fell silent once again, the weight of her words settling over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't know what to say, what to think. Everything about this moment felt wrong, yet I couldn't bring myself to leave. Emily turned away, her hands brushing against Horse's side as she whispered something I couldn't hear. He shifted slightly, the sound of his hooves echoing in the stillness. I watched them, my chest tightening with a mix of anger, confusion, and something I couldn't quite name. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke early, but the house was silent. Emily was already gone, as I'd expected. I stood in the kitchen, staring out the window at the barn in the distance. The faint morning mist hung over the fields, giving the whole scene an eerie stillness. My chest tightened as the events of the previous night replayed in my mind. I had to get to the bottom of this. Whatever Emily was hiding, whatever connection she had with Horse, I needed to know. The uncertainty was gnawing at me, driving me to the brink of madness. By the time the sun was fully up, I found myself walking toward the barn. The air was heavy with the scent of hay and earth as I stepped inside. The shadows seemed deeper in the morning light, and the quiet was almost deafening. I called her name, but there was no response. I glanced around, my eyes darting from stall to stall. Everything seemed normal, but the tension in the air told me otherwise. And then I saw it, a small pile of clothes tucked in the corner near the back wall. Emily's clothes. My breath caught in my throat as I approached. The fabric was neatly folded, as if she'd taken her time undressing. My mind raced, 1,000 questions tumbling over one another. Why were her clothes here? What had she been doing? I heard the faint creak of a wooden beam above me, and my gaze snapped upward. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but when I squinted, there was nothing. My hands balled into fists at my sides as I tried to steady my breathing. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, some crucial piece of the puzzle that would make everything clear. I tried to confront Emily when she finally returned to the house, but she brushed me off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't worry so much," she said, her voice light. "Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. That night, I resolved to follow her again. This time, I wouldn't just watch. I would demand answers. When darkness fell, I waited in the shadows near the barn. The lantern light flickered once again, casting long, eerie shapes on the ground. I crept closer, my heart hammering in my chest as I peered through the crack in the door. Emily was there, as I'd expected. She stood close to Horse, her hand resting on his side as she murmured something too soft for me to hear. My pulse quickened as I stepped inside, my boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. "Emily," I said, my voice firm. She startled, spinning around to face me. For a moment, her expression was a mix of guilt and defiance. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied, stepping closer. "No more games, Emily. I want the truth. What's going on with you and him?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her eyes flicked to Horse, and for a split second, I thought I saw something pass between them, something I couldn't explain. "You wouldn't understand," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Try me," I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "Because from where I'm standing, none of this makes sense." She hesitated, her gaze darting between me and Horse. Then, with a sigh, she stepped aside, her hands trembling slightly as she gestured toward him. "Fine," she said quietly. "If you want answers, here they are." I stared at her, my mind racing. The tension in the barn was suffocating, the silence broken only by the soft rustle of hay beneath Horse's hooves. Emily's eyes were steady, but there was a vulnerability in them that made my chest tighten. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to him, her hand brushing against his side as she murmured something I couldn't make out. He shifted slightly, the sound of his movements echoing in the stillness. For a moment, I thought she was going to say something, offer some explanation that would make sense of everything. But instead, she stepped back, her eyes locking onto mine. "This is who I am," she said, her voice steady but filled with a strange kind of sadness. "And if you can't accept that, maybe you don't really know me at all."